The room was vast, cold, and silent except for the faint hum of energy coursing through the walls. The grand chamber of Epsilon 7 stretched high above, its ceiling lost in shadows. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the weight of the galaxy itself pressed down on everyone inside. Hundreds of beings from countless species filled the rows of seats, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and indifference. Some whispered to each other in languages no human could understand, while others stared forward with unblinking eyes. At the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, a man who had never asked for any of this. Daniel wasn't special. He wasn't a hero or a villain. He was just an ordinary person, someone who had spent most of his life working in a repair shop on Earth. His hands were calloused from years of fixing broken machines, and his clothes were plain, nothing like the elaborate robes worn by the tribunal members seated before him. But today, he wasn't just another faceless human. He was the accused. And the charge? Crimes against interstellar peace. A crime so serious that even hearing the words made his stomach churn. The tribunal members sat elevated on a raised platform, their expressions unreadable behind masks of authority. They represented dozens of alien races, each more intimidating than the last. There was Kael'vor, a towering insectoid creature with shimmering green exoskeleton and compound eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Daniel's soul. Next, to him sat Lyra, a slender being with translucent skin and glowing veins that pulsed softly with every heartbeat. Behind them loomed the rest of the council, their forms strange and alien yet united in their purpose: justice, or at least what passed for it in the eyes of the Galactic Tribunal. Daniel tried to keep his breathing steady, but it was hard. His heart pounded in his chest and sweat trickled down his back despite the chill of the chamber. He glanced around, searching for a friendly face, but there were none. Everyone here saw him as guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence wasn't easy when you didn't even know what you were supposed to have done wrong. Daniel Carter intoned a deep, resonant voice that echoed through the chamber. It belonged to Judge Zorak, a hulking reptilian alien with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian. His golden eyes fixed on Daniel, pinning him in place. You stand accused of smuggling classified technology into restricted sectors of the galaxy. This act is considered a grave threat to interstellar stability. How do you plead? Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. I'm innocent, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't even know what you're talking about. I've never smuggled anything, let alone something classified. A murmur rippled through the crowd, though whether it was disbelief or amusement, Daniel couldn't tell. Judge Zorak leaned forward, his clawed fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. Your plea has been noted. However, evidence has been presented that directly implicates you in these actions. Do you deny possessing knowledge of advanced technology not native to your species? Daniel shook his head vigorously. No, I swear I don't. Someone must have set me up. I'm just a mechanic. I fix things. That's all I've ever done. The judge's expression remained impassive, unmoved by Daniel's desperation. Regardless of your claims, the evidence speaks for itself. Your vessel was intercepted near the border of Sector 42, carrying devices of unknown origin. These devices are now confirmed to be highly sensitive instruments capable of disrupting communication networks across multiple systems. But I didn't put them there, Daniel exclaimed, taking a step forward before stopping himself. He clenched his fists at his sides, frustration bubbling inside him. Someone planted those devices on my ship. I didn't even know they were there. Silence, Judge Zorak barked, his voice reverberating like thunder. The room fell deathly quiet. This tribunal does not tolerate outbursts. You will address us with respect or face additional charges. Daniel bit his tongue, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew losing his temper wouldn't help, but it was so hard not to scream. Everything happening to him felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare he couldn't wake up from. How had he ended up here? Just weeks ago, he'd been living a simple life, fixing engines and trying to make ends meet. Now he was standing in front of beings who viewed humans as little more than pests. beings who could destroy him with a single word. As the trial continued, the prosecution laid out its case. Holographic images appeared in the air above the chamber, showing grainy footage of Daniel's ship being searched. The cameras zoomed in on compartments hidden within the hull, revealing strange devices glowing faintly with blue light. Expert witnesses testified about the potential dangers of such technology falling into the wrong hands. Each piece of evidence painted Daniel as a traitor, a saboteur, a menace to the galaxy. Throughout it all, Daniel listened in stunned silence. None of it made sense. Yes, he owned a ship. It was old and clunky, patched together with spare parts. But it was his livelihood. He used it to travel between planets, picking up odd jobs wherever he could find work. But smuggling, that wasn't him. He didn't have the connections, the resources, or the guts to pull off something like that. Then came the moment he dreaded most. The tribunal announced its verdict. After careful deliberation, Judge Zorak declared, his voice ringing out like a death knell, "We find the defendant, Daniel Carter, guilty of all charges. In accordance with Galactic law, you are hereby sentenced to exile on Xylos 9, effective immediately." A collective gasp swept through the chamber. Even the alien spectators seemed shocked by the severity of the punishment. Xylos 9 wasn't just any prison, it was a death world. Few who were sent there survived more than a few days. Acidic rain burned through flesh, carnivorous creatures hunted relentlessly, and the planet's gravity crushed even the strongest beings. Exile to Xylos 9 was essentially a death sentence. "No!" Daniel shouted, panic overtaking him. "You can't do this. I'm innocent. Please, you have to believe me." But no one listened. Guards moved in swiftly, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him toward the exit. He struggled, kicking and shouting, but it was useless. The tribunal had spoken, and there was no appeal. As he was hauled away, Daniel caught sight of a young woman watching him from the sidelines. She looked human, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. For a brief moment their gazes met, and he thought he saw sympathy flicker across her face. Her name was Emily Dawson, though Daniel didn't know that yet. She was an advocate assigned to oversee executions, ensuring that sentences handed down by the tribunal were carried out properly. But as she watched Daniel being taken away, something stirred within her, a nagging feeling that something about this case wasn't right. The evidence seemed too convenient, too perfect, and Daniel's protests, though desperate, didn't sound like those of a guilty man. Later that evening, Emily sat alone in her quarters reviewing the case files. She scrolled through page after page of data, her brow furrowed in concentration. Something about the timeline didn't add up. According to the records, Daniel's ship had been boarded during a routine inspection. But why had inspectors singled him out in the first place? And how had they known exactly where to look for the hidden devices? Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. She'd seen plenty of cases like this before. Humans railroaded by a system that viewed them as expendable. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Daniel had pleaded his innocence, his voice raw with emotion. Or maybe it was the subtle inconsistencies in the evidence. Whatever it was, Emily knew she couldn't ignore it. As she closed the file and turned off her screen, a decision formed in her mind. She would dig deeper. If there was even a sliver of truth to Daniel's claims, she owed it to him. And to herself. To uncover it. Little did she know her investigation would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the Galactic Tribunal. And somewhere far away, aboard a transport ship hurtling toward Xylos 9, Daniel Carter stared out into the endless void of space, wondering if anyone would ever believe him. The transport ship descended through the thick, crimson clouds of Xylos 9, its engines groaning under the strain of the planet's oppressive gravity. Daniel Carter sat alone in the dimly lit cabin, his hands cuffed to a metal bar bolted to the floor. The air inside the ship was stale and cold, but it was nothing compared to what awaited him outside. Through the small viewport, he could see flashes of lightning illuminating the toxic atmosphere below. The ground was shrouded in darkness, obscured by swirling storms that never seemed to end. As the ship broke through the final layer of clouds, The surface of Xylos 9 came into view. It was a wasteland, a jagged expanse of blackened rock and bubbling pools of acidic sludge. Rivers of molten material snaked across the landscape, glowing faintly in the dim light. The horizon stretched, endlessly, broken only by towering spires of stone that jutted upward like broken teeth. It was a place designed to break anyone who dared set foot on it. The ship landed with a jolt and the door hissed open, revealing a world that felt more like a nightmare than reality. A gust of hot sulfuric air rushed into the cabin, making Daniel cough violently. The guards, two heavily armored aliens with expressionless faces, grabbed him by the arms and dragged him out onto the rocky terrain. Once outside, they unceremoniously removed his cuffs and shoved him forward. "Good luck, human," one of them sneered before climbing back aboard the ship. Moments later, the engines roared to life, and the vessel lifted off, leaving Daniel standing alone in the middle of hell. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there staring at the retreating ship. His heart pounded in his chest and his mind raced with fear and disbelief. He had heard stories about Xylos 9, tales whispered among prisoners and guards alike. No one survived here for long. The planet itself was a predator, every inch of it, hostile and unforgiving. And yet, here he was, abandoned without so much as a weapon or supplies. He took a deep breath, or tried to. The air burned his lungs sharp and acrid, forcing him to cough again. He realized quickly that breathing would be a challenge, let alone surviving. Still, he couldn't afford to panic. Panicking wouldn't help him stay alive. Instead, he focused on what he could control, finding shelter and staying alert. Daniel scanned his surroundings, searching for anything that might offer protection. Not far away, he spotted a cluster of jagged rocks rising from the ground like a natural fortress. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With no time to waste, he began moving toward it, his legs trembling under the weight of the planet's gravity. Every step felt like lifting weights, and after only a few minutes, sweat poured down his face despite the chill in the air. Reaching the rocks, he collapsed against one of them, gasping for breath. His body ached, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to keep going. Using his hands, he started clearing debris from beneath an overhang, creating a small space where he could hide. It wasn't perfect, but it would shield him from the worst of the elements. For now. Just as he finished arranging his makeshift shelter, a low growl echoed through the silence. Daniel froze, his blood running cold. Slowly, he turned his head and saw movement in the distance. At first, it was just shadows shifting against the rocks, but then shapes emerged, long, sinewy bodies covered in mottled gray scales. They moved, with eerie grace, their glowing red eyes fixed on him. Predators. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He grabbed a loose rock from the ground, clutching it tightly in his hand. He knew it wouldn't be enough to fight off the creatures, but it was all he had. As the pack crept closer, their growls growing louder, Daniel backed into his shelter, pressing himself against the wall. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Then he noticed something above him, a narrow ledge jutting out from the rock face. Summoning every ounce of strength, Daniel leapt upward, scrambling for purchase on the rough surface. His fingers clawed at the stone and his feet slipped repeatedly, but he managed to pull himself onto the ledge just as the first creature lunged at him. Below, the pack circled, snapping and snarling, unable to reach him. For now, he was safe, but only temporarily. Once the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit him like a wave. He slumped against the ledge, closing his eyes for a brief moment. But sleep wasn't an option. The predators were still waiting, and the storm clouds above showed no signs of breaking. Acidic rain was common on Xylos 9, and exposure to it meant certain death. Daniel needed to find better shelter, and fast. After catching his breath, he climbed higher, using the uneven surface of the rocks to scale upward. The climb was grueling, each movement sapping what little energy he had left. By the time he reached the top, his hands were raw and bleeding and his legs felt like jelly. But when he looked around, he realized the effort had been worth it. From this vantage point, he could see farther than before, spotting a cluster of ruins in the distance. Broken structures jutted out of the ground, partially buried beneath layers of ash and debris. They looked ancient, weathered by centuries of neglect, but they also looked sturdy enough to provide refuge. With renewed determination, Daniel began making his way toward the ruins. The journey was slow and perilous, the uneven terrain threatening to send him tumbling at every step. Along the way, he encountered more dangers: sinkholes filled with bubbling acid, sudden gusts of wind that nearly knocked him off balance, and the ever-present threat of predators lurking in the shadows. But somehow he pushed through, driven by sheer willpower. When he finally reached the ruins, night had fallen, plunging the landscape into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled like a banshee. Daniel ducked inside one of the larger structures, grateful for the solid walls that shielded him from the elements. Inside, the air was marginally better, though still thick with dust and decay. He collapsed onto the floor, too tired to move another inch. It was then that he noticed something strange. Carved into the walls were symbols, faded but unmistakable. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate markings, patterns etched with precision. Curious, Daniel ran his fingers over them, tracing their intricate designs. They reminded him of circuit boards, the kind he used to repair back on Earth. Could these ruins hold some kind of technology? And if so, why would such advanced artifacts exist on a death world like Xylos 9? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement outside. At first, he thought it might be another predator, but the noise was different. Quieter, more deliberate. Someone or something was approaching. Heart racing, Daniel grabbed a shard of broken stone and prepared to defend himself. The figure that appeared in the doorway wasn't a monster, however. It was a woman. She stepped cautiously into the room, her piercing green eyes scanning the area before landing on Daniel. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and her clothes were patched and worn, but she carried herself with confidence. In one hand, she held a makeshift spear tipped with sharpened metal. "You're new here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What are you doing in my territory?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her presence. "Your territory?" he stammered. She nodded, stepping closer, but keeping her spear raised. "I've been surviving on this rock for years. You don't last long unless you stake your claim. So I'll ask again, what are you doing here?" "I didn't have much of a choice," Daniel admitted, lowering his makeshift weapon. "I was exiled. Just got here today." The woman studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she lowered her spear slightly. "Exile, huh? That explains why you look like you're about to keel over. Name's Rachel Monroe. And you are?" "Daniel Carter," he replied, relief washing over him. For the first time since arriving on Xylos 9, he didn't feel completely alone. Rachel gestured for him to follow her deeper into the ruins. "Come on. If you want to live through the night, you'll need better shelter than this. Follow me." As they walked, Rachel explained how she had managed to survive on Xylos 9. She had been exiled 5 years earlier, accused of espionage, a crime she denied just as vehemently as Daniel did. Over time, she had learned the planet's rhythms, adapted to its challenges, and even discovered ways to use the ruins to her advantage. She scavenged materials from crashed ships and abandoned camps, fashioning tools and weapons to protect herself. "You're lucky I found you," she said as they entered a larger chamber. "Most people don't last more than a day out there. Those predators, they can smell fear. If you show weakness, they'll tear you apart." Daniel nodded, taking in his surroundings. The chamber was surprisingly intact, with remnants of furniture and equipment scattered throughout. Rachel had clearly made it her home, rigging up rudimentary systems to filter the air and collect water. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional, and infinitely better than the ledge he'd been clinging to earlier. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at him since their encounter. Rachel shrugged, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be thrown to the wolves. Besides, 2 heads are better than 1. Maybe together, We can figure out a way off this rock." Those words ignited a spark of hope in Daniel's chest. For the first time since his trial, he allowed himself to believe that survival might not be the end of the road. The deeper Daniel and Rachel ventured into the ruins, the more they realized they were uncovering something extraordinary. The ancient structures weren't just remnants of a forgotten civilization. They were a labyrinth of secrets, each chamber revealing new puzzles and dangers. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under certain angles of light, as if alive. Machines hummed softly in the background, their mechanisms still functioning after who knows how many centuries. It was clear that whoever had built this place had possessed technology far beyond anything either of them had ever seen. One day, while exploring a particularly large chamber, they stumbled upon something that made their hearts race. A vault. It was sealed tightly, its surface etched with intricate patterns that matched the symbols they'd seen throughout the ruins. In the center of the door was a circular indentation, clearly designed for some kind of key or tool. Rachel ran her fingers over it, her brow furrowed in thought. "This isn't just a random lock," she said, glancing at Daniel. "It's a puzzle. Whoever built this wanted to make sure only the right people could get inside." Daniel nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "If we can figure out how to open it, there's no telling what we might find. Maybe answers about why I'm here, or even proof of my innocence." But solving the puzzle wasn't going to be easy. The symbols on the vault didn't match any language they recognized, and the patterns seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. They spent hours studying the markings, trying to decipher their meaning. Rachel suggested they look for clues elsewhere in the ruins, so they split up temporarily, each searching nearby chambers for anything that might help. While Rachel scoured the upper levels, Daniel stayed behind, focusing intently on the vault. He traced the lines, with his fingers noticing subtle grooves that seemed intentional. Then as he leaned closer, something clicked. A small section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a crystal-like object, glowing faintly with a soft blue light. It fit perfectly into the indentation on the vault. As soon as Daniel inserted the crystal, the entire room came alive. Panels on the walls lit up, casting an eerie glow across the chamber. The symbols on the vault began to rearrange themselves, forming a sequence that matched the carvings they'd seen earlier. With a low rumble, the vault door slowly opened, revealing a space filled with holographic projections and data crystals. Rachel returned just in time to see the display activate. Her eyes widened as she stepped forward, taking in the sight. This is incredible," she whispered. "These records must have been here for thousands of years." Together, they began sifting through the information. The holograms showed images of advanced cities bustling with life and technology. There were depictions of ships traveling between stars, machines performing tasks humans couldn't dream of, and beings whose forms were both beautiful and alien. But alongside, these wonders were darker scenes, images of destruction, battles, and planets reduced to ash. It was clear that whatever civilization had thrived here had fallen victim to its own hubris. Then, buried deep within the archives, they found something that sent chills down their spines. Evidence of corruption within the Galactic Tribunal itself. The records detailed a conspiracy involving high-ranking officials who had manipulated trials, falsified evidence, and exiled individuals deemed inconvenient or threatening to their power. Names, dates, and transactions were all meticulously recorded, implicating dozens of members, including those who had sentenced Daniel to Xylos 9. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and hope. "This proves I didn't do anything wrong. Someone framed me because they wanted me out of the way." Rachel nodded grimly. "And not just you. Look at this." She pointed to another hologram showing lists of names, other exiles, many of whom had vanished without a trace. "They've been doing this for years, using Xylos 9 as a dumping ground for anyone who gets too close to the truth." For a moment, they simply stared at the data, overwhelmed by its implications. If they could get this information off-world, it could expose the tribunal's crimes and spark widespread reform. But escaping Xylos 9 wouldn't be easy, not with predators, storms, and automated defenses standing in their way. And even if they managed to leave, they'd need allies willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. "We have to try," Daniel said firmly, breaking the silence. "If we don't, nothing will change. People like us will keep getting thrown away, and the tribunal will keep doing whatever it wants." Rachel hesitated, her expression conflicted. She had survived on Xylos 9 for years by staying invisible, avoiding attention and keeping her head down. Getting involved in something this big went against every survival instinct she had. But looking at Daniel, seeing the determination in his eyes, she realized she couldn't turn away. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. "All right," she said finally. "We'll do it. But we're going to need a plan, and probably a miracle." Meanwhile, back in the stars, Emily Dawson was making progress of her own. Since the trial, she had been digging deeper into Daniel's case, poring over files and cross-referencing data. At first, her investigation had been slow and frustrating, hampered by red tape and resistance from higher-ups. But as she pieced together fragments of information, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed directly to corruption within the tribunal. Her breakthrough came when she discovered discrepancies in the timeline of events leading up to Daniel's arrest. According to official reports, inspectors had intercepted his ship based on a tip-off from an anonymous source. But when Emily dug deeper, she found no record of such a tip-off. Instead, she uncovered evidence suggesting that the devices planted on Daniel's ship had been placed there deliberately by someone with access to classified technology. Convinced she was onto something, Emily reached out to Alex Bennett, and Neu, old friend and former pilot turned smuggler. Alex had always been skeptical of authority, and though he rarely stuck his neck out for anyone, he owed Emily a favor. When she explained what she had uncovered, he agreed to help, but warned her that exposing the tribunal would come at a cost. "They won't go down without a fight," Alex said, leaning back in his chair. "You're talking about powerful people with resources we can't even imagine. If we're going to take them on, we'll need to be smart and fast." Emily nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I know it's dangerous, but if we don't do something, innocent people will keep suffering. Daniel deserves a chance to clear his name." With Alex's help, Emily began gathering allies, disillusioned tribunal staff, sympathetic alien diplomats, and rogue operatives willing to risk their lives for justice. They worked in secret, communicating through encrypted channels and meeting in secluded locations. Slowly but surely, they formed a network dedicated to exposing the truth. One evening, as Emily reviewed the latest batch of evidence, Alex walked into her makeshift office carrying a datapad. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, handing it to her. On the screen was a transmission intercepted from Xylos 9. It was garbled and incomplete, but one thing was clear. Someone on the planet had accessed classified information and was attempting to send it off-world. "That has to be Daniel," Emily said, her heart pounding. "He's still alive, and he's found something big." Alex raised an eyebrow. "If he's got intel that good, then he's in serious trouble. The tribunal will stop at nothing to silence him." Emily clenched her fists, determination blazing in her eyes. "Then we can't let them. We need to get to Xylos 9, and fast." Back on the Death World, Daniel and Rachel prepared for what lay ahead. They gathered supplies, fashioned weapons from scavenged materials, and mapped out potential escape routes. Every step felt like walking a tightrope, balancing hope against the crushing weight of danger. But despite the odds, they refused to give up. One night, as they sat huddled in their shelter, Rachel turned to Daniel. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. If we don't try, we've already lost." Rachel smiled faintly, nodding. "Then let's make sure we win." Little did they know, their actions were about to set off a chain reaction that would reverberate across the galaxy and force everyone, from the highest-ranking officials to the lowest exiles, to confront the truth about the system they lived under. The rescue mission was risky, and everyone involved knew it. Getting to Xylos 9 was dangerous enough, but landing on the planet undetected? That was almost impossible. The tribunal had eyes everywhere, and their patrols were relentless. Even with Alex Bennett's piloting skills and Emily Dawson's careful planning, the odds of success were slim. But they didn't have a choice. If they wanted to save Daniel and expose the corruption within the tribunal, they had to try. Alex's ship, the Shadowhawk, was small and fast, built for stealth rather than combat. Its matte black hull blended seamlessly into the darkness of space, making it nearly invisible to sensors. Inside, the crew consisted of just 3 people: Alex, Emily, and Jarek, a tech specialist who had joined them after hearing about their cause. Jarek was quiet and reserved, but his expertise in hacking and navigation made him invaluable. As they approached Xylos 9, the tension aboard the ship was palpable. The planet loomed ahead, its crimson skies swirling with storms that crackled with lightning. Acidic rain streaked across the surface like veins, while jagged spires jutted upward like broken bones. It was a place designed to kill, and yet somewhere down there, Daniel Carter was still alive. "All right," Alex said, breaking the silence as he adjusted the controls. "We're entering the atmosphere in 5 minutes. Once we hit the surface, we've got one shot at this. If we screw up, we're not walking away." Emily nodded, gripping the edge of her seat tightly. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong, what would go wrong, but she forced herself to stay focused. This wasn't just about saving Daniel anymore. It was about justice. About proving that even the most powerful systems could be held accountable. Jarek leaned over his console, fingers flying across the keyboard as he worked to disable nearby surveillance drones. "I'm patching into their systems now," he muttered. "If I can loop their feeds, we'll have a window, maybe 10 minutes, to land without being detected." 10 minutes? Alex raised an eyebrow. "That's cutting it close." "It's all we've got," Jarek replied curtly. "Just don't crash us and we might make it." The ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere, buffeted by violent winds and electrical discharges. Outside, the view was chaos. A kaleidoscope of reds and blacks illuminated by flashes of lightning. The temperature inside the cockpit rose sharply, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning metal. Alex gritted his teeth, his hands steady on the controls as he maneuvered through the turbulence. "Hold on!" he shouted as the ship dropped, suddenly narrowly avoiding a bolt of energy that arced across the sky. "This is gonna get bumpy." Emily braced herself, her knuckles white as she clung to her seat. She glanced at Jarek, who was muttering under his breath as he worked furiously to maintain their cover. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he didn't stop. Finally, he let out a sharp breath. "Loop complete," he announced. "We're invisible for now. Get us down before they notice." Alex nodded, guiding the ship toward a cluster of ruins that matched the coordinates Emily had provided. According to Daniel's garbled transmission, he and Rachel were hiding somewhere in that area. As they descended, the ground came into view, a jagged wasteland littered with debris and shadows. The ship touched down with a thud, kicking up clouds of ash. "Go," Alex said, turning to Emily. "Jarek and I will keep watch. You find them." Emily grabbed a small pack containing medical supplies and tools, then slipped out of the ship. The moment she stepped outside, the full force of Xylos 9 hit her. The air burned her lungs, and the oppressive gravity made every step feel like lifting weights. Lightning split the sky overhead, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. She pulled up the map on her wrist device, orienting herself before moving forward. It didn't take long to find signs of life. Footprints in the dirt led toward a large structure partially buried beneath layers of ash. Emily followed them cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of a small knife tucked into her belt. As she approached, she heard voices, low and urgent. "Someone's coming," a woman's voice said sharply. Emily froze, raising her hands to show she wasn't armed. "Wait, I'm here to help," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. A figure emerged from the shadows, holding a makeshift spear. It was Rachel Monroe. Her piercing green eyes scanned Emily carefully, assessing whether she posed a threat. Behind her stood Daniel, his face pale but determined. You're Emily? Daniel asked hesitantly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Yes, Emily replied, lowering her hands. I work for the tribunal. Or well, I did. I've been investigating your case. You were framed, Daniel. Everything points to corruption at the highest levels. Rachel lowered her spear slightly but didn't relax completely. How do we know you're telling the truth? Emily reached into her pack and pulled out a data pad. I brought proof. Records, transactions, names, all implicating the tribunal members who orchestrated this. But we need to get off this planet if we want to use it. Daniel exchanged a glance with Rachel, then nodded. All right. We'll come with you. But we're bringing the evidence too. They quickly gathered the data crystals and holographic records they had uncovered in the ruins, packing them securely. Time was running out. The loop Jarek had created wouldn't last forever. As they hurried back to the ship, the sound of engines roared in the distance. They're here, Rachel said grimly, pointing to a squadron of patrol ships descending from the sky. Automated defense turrets activated around the perimeter of the ruins, their weapons trained on any movement. We need to move. Now, Emily urged, breaking into a run despite the crushing gravity. When they reached the Shadowhawk, Alex and Jarek were already waiting, weapons drawn. About time, Alex said, ushering them aboard. Strap in, this is going to get messy. No sooner had they closed the hatch than the patrol ships opened fire. Energy blasts tore through the air, striking the ground around them. Alex fired. Up the engines, lifting off just as a turret locked onto their position. The ship rocked violently as it ascended, dodging incoming fire. Jarek, can you disable those turrets? Alex shouted over the noise. I'm trying, Jarek replied, his fingers flying across the console. A moment later, several turrets exploded in bursts of flame. Got 'em! But more are coming online. Hang on, Alex yelled, pushing the ship to its limits. He executed a series of sharp maneuvers, weaving between blasts and debris as they climbed higher into the atmosphere. The patrol ships pursued relentlessly, firing non-stop. Inside the cabin, Emily clung to her seat, her heart pounding. She glanced at Daniel, who was clutching the pack of evidence tightly. His expression was a mix of fear and determination. They were so close to freedom, to exposing the truth. They couldn't fail now. Finally, the Shadowhawk broke through the planet's toxic clouds, emerging into the relative calm of space. But the danger wasn't over yet. The patrol ships followed them, closing in fast. We need a distraction, Alex said, his voice tense. Jarek, deploy the decoys. Jarek complied, launching a series of drones that mimicked the ship's signature. The patrol ships hesitated, splitting their focus between the decoys and the real vessel. It was just enough of an opening for Alex to punch the engines into full throttle, leaving the pursuers behind. As they jumped into hyperspace, the crew let out a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in days or maybe weeks, they allowed themselves to breathe. We did it, Emily said softly, looking at Daniel. Now comes the hard part. Daniel nodded, his grip tightening on the pack. Let's make sure no one else has to suffer like we did. But even as they celebrated their escape, none of them realized the true extent of the conspiracy they had uncovered, or the lengths the tribunal would go to in order to protect its secrets. Their journey was far from over. The Shadowhawk sped through hyperspace, its crew exhausted but determined. Inside the cramped cabin, the mood was tense but hopeful. They had escaped Xylos 9, retrieved evidence of corruption within the tribunal, and were now racing toward Epsilon 7 to confront the very system that had condemned Daniel Carter. Yet despite their success so far, none of them felt truly safe. The tribunal was vast, powerful, and ruthless, and they knew it wouldn't take kindly to being exposed. Daniel sat in silence, staring at the pack containing the data crystals and holographic records. He could hardly believe how far they'd come. Just weeks ago, he had been a mechanic living an ordinary life on Earth. Now he was part of a mission that could change the course of galactic history or get them all killed. His mind kept drifting back to Rachel, who had sacrificed herself during their escape. Her bravery still weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She believed in this, Emily said softly, breaking the silence. She had noticed Daniel's distant expression and guessed where his thoughts had wandered. Rachel gave everything to help us. We owe it to her to see this through. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. I know. It's just, she didn't have to do that. She could have stayed behind. But she didn't, Emily replied firmly. And neither will we. What we're doing, it's bigger than any one person. If we succeed, no one else will suffer like you did. No one else will be thrown away because someone wanted them silenced. Her words struck a chord with everyone on board. Alex, who had spent years avoiding trouble and flying under the radar, found himself nodding along. Even Jarek, usually quiet and detached, glanced up from his console with a rare flicker of emotion in his eyes. For once, they weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for something greater. As the ship approached Epsilon 7, Emily outlined their plan. They couldn't simply march into the tribunal chambers and present their evidence. They needed allies, people powerful enough to amplify their message and protect them from retaliation. To that end, Emily had reached out to several key figures during their journey, including sympathetic alien diplomats and disillusioned tribunal staff. These individuals had agreed to meet them secretly on the outskirts of the floating citadel, where they would coordinate their next move. We'll split into 2 groups, Emily explained as they prepared to disembark. Alex and Jarek will stay with the ship and monitor communications. They'll alert us if anything goes wrong. Daniel and I will deliver the evidence to our contacts and prepare for the tribunal hearing. Once we expose the truth, there's no turning back. Understood, Alex said, giving her a solemn nod. Just make sure you don't get caught before the big reveal. Emily smiled faintly. Don't worry, I've been playing this game longer than you think. With their roles assigned, the group landed discreetly on a remote platform near the edge of Epsilon 7. As promised, their allies were waiting, 7 beings representing various species and factions. Among them was Lyranix, the translucent-skinned council member Daniel remembered from his trial. At first glance, it seemed odd that she would side with them, but Emily explained that Lyranix had grown disillusioned with the tribunal's corruption and sought reform. This is it, Lyranix said, her glowing veins pulsing faintly as she addressed the group. Once we present this evidence, the tribunal will crumble, but they won't go quietly. Are you prepared for the consequences? Yes, Daniel said without hesitation. Whatever happens, I'm ready. The others echoed his sentiment, their resolve unwavering. With the plan finalized, they dispersed, each heading to their designated positions. Daniel and Emily made their way to the heart of the citadel, carrying copies of the evidence in secure cases. Along the way, Emily briefed Daniel on tribunal protocol, coaching him on how to address the council members without appearing too emotional or defensive. You're not just a victim anymore, she told him. You're a symbol, a human standing up to injustice. Show them strength, not fear. When they arrived at the grand chamber, the scene was eerily similar to Daniel's trial. The same rows of spectators filled the seats, though this time, whispers of anticipation buzzed through the crowd. Rumors of an impending scandal had spread quickly, drawing attention from across the galaxy. The tribunal members sat elevated on their platform, their expressions unreadable behind masks of authority. Judge Zorak leaned forward, his golden eyes locking onto Daniel. What is the meaning of this intrusion? He demanded, his voice resonating. Like thunder, Emily stepped forward, holding up the case containing the evidence. Your Honor, we have uncovered proof of corruption within the tribunal. Crimes that span decades, falsified trials, manipulated evidence, and exiles orchestrated to eliminate threats to your power. Today, we bring these crimes to light. A murmur rippled through the chamber as gasps and murmurs erupted among the spectators. Judge Zorak's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Lyranix rose from her seat, addressing the assembly. What Ms. Dawson says is true, she declared, her voice steady despite the weight of her betrayal. I have witnessed these acts myself and remained silent for too long. The tribunal has betrayed its purpose to uphold justice. It is time for accountability. Chaos erupted as tribunal members shouted accusations at one another, while spectators debated loudly among themselves. Some called for immediate investigation, while others dismissed the claims as lies. Amidst the turmoil, Daniel stood tall, clutching the evidence tightly. This was his moment, not just to clear his name, but to demand justice for everyone who had suffered under the tribunal's rule. Finally, Judge Zorak slammed his gavel, silencing the room. "Enough," he roared. "If you claim to possess evidence, then present it. Let the truth decide." Emily opened the case, projecting holographic images and documents into the air above the chamber. The records revealed names, dates, and transactions, implicating high-ranking officials in countless crimes. Faces paled as the evidence played out, undeniable and damning. Gasps turned to shouts of outrage as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to feel hope. Justice wasn't guaranteed, not yet, but the tide was turning. The tribunal's facade of infallibility had cracked, and the cracks were spreading fast. But even as victory seemed within reach, danger loomed. Outside the chamber, armed guards moved into position, their orders clear: silence the threat at any cost. Inside, tensions simmered, ready to boil over. Whatever happened next, Daniel knew one thing for certain: they had ignited a firestorm that would reshape the galaxy forever. Later that night, as the tribunal scrambled to contain the fallout, Daniel sat alone in a quiet corner of the citadel. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but sleep eluded him. Too much had happened, too many sacrifices made. Rachel's face lingered in his mind, her final act of courage etched into his memory. He owed her, and everyone else who had suffered, under the tribunal's tyranny, a better future. Emily joined him after a while, sitting beside him in silence. Finally, she spoke. "You did good today, Daniel. More than good. You gave people hope." He looked at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Hope isn't enough, not yet. But maybe it's a start." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination that burned within him. "We'll keep fighting, together." And together, they would, because even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity and compassion could prevail. The days following the tribunal hearing were a whirlwind of chaos and change. The evidence presented by Daniel, Emily, and their allies had sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Tribunal was no longer seen as an untouchable authority but as a flawed institution riddled with corruption. Public outrage spread like wildfire, fueled by media coverage that exposed the depth of the conspiracy. Protesters gathered outside the floating citadel of Epsilon 7, demanding accountability and reform. Even alien species who had long distrusted, humans began to see them in a new light, resilient, courageous, and capable of challenging even the most powerful systems. Inside the tribunal chambers, panic reigned. High-ranking officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, pointing fingers at one another in a desperate bid to save their reputations. Some resigned immediately, disappearing into hiding. Others tried to deny involvement, only to be confronted with irrefutable proof of their crimes. Arrests followed swiftly, with tribunal enforcers rounding up those implicated in the corruption. It was a purge unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and it wasn't over yet. For Daniel Carter, the aftermath was surreal. Just weeks ago, he had been a condemned man facing certain death on Xylos 9. Now he was hailed as a hero, a symbol of resistance against injustice. Reporters swarmed him wherever he went, eager to hear his story. Diplomats invited him to speak at conferences and summits. Offers poured in from every corner of the galaxy. Prestigious positions, lucrative contracts, even honorary titles. But Daniel declined them all. He didn't want fame or power. All he wanted was to go home, to Earth, where his journey had begun. "Not a leader," he told Emily one evening as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the citadel. "I'm just a mechanic who got caught up in something bigger than myself. I did what I had to do, not for glory, but because it was right." Emily smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the horizon. Sometimes doing the right thing is enough. You've already inspired so many people, Daniel. That's more than most can say. He nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. What about you? What will you do now? She hesitated before answering, her expression thoughtful. I'll keep working to make sure this never happens again. There are still flaws in the system, still people being treated unfairly. Someone has to fight for them. Her words resonated with Daniel, reminding him of Rachel and the sacrifices she had made. Though her loss still weighed heavily on him, he knew she would have wanted him to keep moving forward. She had believed in justice, just as Emily did, and just as he did now. As the tribunal underwent sweeping reforms, its members replaced by representatives elected through transparent processes, Daniel prepared to leave Epsilon 7. Alex and Jarek offered to fly him back to Earth, insisting they owed him that much. The Shadowhawk was cramped and battered after their harrowing escape from Xylos 9, but it felt like home to Daniel. During the journey, the three of them shared stories and laughter, finding solace in each other's company. For the first time, in months, Daniel felt at peace. When they finally reached Earth, Daniel stepped off the ship onto familiar soil. The air smelled clean, fresh, and alive, compared to the toxic atmosphere of Xylos 9. He looked around at the rolling hills and distant cityscape, feeling a surge of gratitude. This was where he belonged, not among the stars, but here, surrounded by simplicity and quiet. Alex clapped him on the shoulder before climbing back aboard the ship. Take care of yourself, Daniel. And remember, you're always welcome if you need us. Thanks, Daniel replied, smiling genuinely for the first time in what felt like forever. You guys saved my life. I won't forget that. As the Shadowhawk lifted off and disappeared into the sky, Daniel turned toward the horizon. His workshop wasn't far away, tucked behind a row of trees near the edge of town. Walking there felt strange, yet comforting, like slipping into an old pair of shoes. When he opened the door, the smell of oil and metal greeted him like an old friend. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into his work, fixing engines and tinkering with machines. Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything he'd been through. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, curious about his sudden reappearance after months of absence. He kept his explanations vague, saying only that he'd been traveling for work. Most accepted his story without question, though a few suspected there was more to it. But Daniel didn't mind. Some stories weren't meant to be told. One day, as he worked on a particularly stubborn engine, a package arrived at his doorstep. It was small and unmarked with no return address. Inside, he found a single data crystal and a handwritten note. For when you're ready to share your story. Daniel held the crystal in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. Emily must have sent it, compiling all the evidence they had uncovered during their mission. She hadn't pressured him to use it, leaving the decision entirely up to him. Part of him wanted to destroy it, to leave the past behind and focus on rebuilding his life. But another part knew the truth needed to be preserved, for future generations, for those who might face similar injustices someday. He placed the crystal carefully in a drawer, deciding he would think about it later. For now, he returned to his work, letting the rhythmic clinking of tools soothe his mind. He didn't need to rush. The galaxy had already changed because of what he had done. Maybe one day, he would write his story down. Or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, the scars of his ordeal would fade with time, but the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. Meanwhile, Emily Dawson continued her work as an advocate, ensuring that no one else would suffer unjustly at the hands of corrupt systems. Her efforts earned her both praise and criticism, but she remained steadfast in her mission. She often thought of Daniel, wondering how he was adjusting to life back on Earth. Occasionally, she considered visiting him, but she decided against it. He deserved his peace, and she had her own battles to fight. On a quiet evening aboard a diplomatic vessel, Emily gazed out at the stars, reflecting on everything that had happened. They had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not because They were stronger or smarter than their enemies, but because they had refused to give up. Hope, courage, and resilience had carried them through, proving that even the smallest voices could spark monumental change. And somewhere far away, on a planet bathed in crimson skies, the ruins of Xylos 9 stood silent, their secrets safeguarded once more. The death world remained a harsh and unforgiving place, but its role in exposing the truth ensured that it would never again serve as a tool of oppression. Instead, it became a reminder, a testament to the strength of those who dared to challenge the darkness. In the end, humanity proved stronger than any condemnation. Daniel Carter, a simple mechanic from Earth, had stunned the galaxy not with weapons or wealth, but with hope, courage, and redemption. And though his journey had ended, quietly, its impact would echo across the stars for generations to come.